There was a time Pearl Maddox believed her best years were behind her. She had the voice of a meadowlark and a heart that still fluttered like it was 20. But to the Cowboy Carter Tour scouts, she was just a big old gal with too many years and too much skirt. They said it with a smile that cut like a branding iron. Pearl had traveled all night to that audition, 51 years old, hair pinned up, neat song rehearsed for weeks, dress borrowed from a friend who still believed in magic. But when she stepped onto the dusty wooden stage, no one even looked up. One man leaned to another and whispered, "Lord, we'll need a sturdier bench." They laughed. She sang anyway. No one clapped, not even once. She rode the stagecoach back to Dry Rock with her guitar in one hand and her hope folded into silence in the other. And maybe that would have been the end of it, a forgotten woman in a forgotten town slowly vanishing between feed sacks and laundry lines. But then, a rancher named Harlan True saw her unloading hay at the general store. He didn't see her size. He saw the way her shoulders dipped when she thought no one noticed. He saw the way she hummed to the horses like they were the only ones who ever listened. He saw something. More. What happened next wasn't in any show, wasn't in any songbook or Sunday paper, but it became the kind of story whispered over campfires and under starlight. Because sometimes the world turns its back, and sometimes a man quietly turns toward you and stays. She lost a dream that day in front of a cruel crowd. But what she found under the prairie sky, that's what made her a legend. So what did Harlan True offer that no audience ever could? And how did Pearl's rejected voice become the soul of the frontier? Stay with us as we unravel a story of quiet resilience, late love, and the kind of strength no stage ever applauds, but the heart never forgets. Too fat to be seen, or just waiting to be truly known. Let's find out together. The next town wasn't a music city. It was barely even a town, just a weather-beaten stop called Dry River, known more for its wind than its welcome. Pearl Whitmore arrived in the late afternoon, her boots thick with stagecoach dust and her heart even heavier. She had no gig waiting, no applause, just a letter from a woman named Mavis Greeley who ran a boarding house and once sang backup in a traveling church choir. They'd exchanged letters once years ago after Pearl sang at a wedding in El Paso. Mavis had written, "If you ever find yourself with nowhere else to sing, come north. This land could use a softer sound." Pearl had folded the note into her guitar case like a prayer, and now, with nowhere else to go, she had come. Mavis welcomed her with a long hug and a pot of hot stew, but it was the silence after supper that cut deeper than any word. Mavis looked Pearl up and down and said gently, "You might not want to unpack everything, hon. Folks around here, well, they don't always know how to make room for what's bigger than their understanding." Pearl nodded. She was used to being warned about her size, but it still hurt to realize even kindness had caveats. Later that week, she asked around town about work. Most shrugged. Some looked away. The dressmaker said she couldn't fit behind the counter. The saloon said they already had a girl on the piano. And the church? The church said they only hired sopranos. Pearl was a contralto, and she was tired. It wasn't until Harlan Coyle, the reclusive widowed rancher who owned most of the valley, rode into town and posted a handbill that things changed. Help wanted. Housework, cooking, no frills, no chatter. The townsfolk whispered that no woman had lasted more than a week at the Coyle ranch. He never spoke much. Just rode into town every few months and left with supplies and silence. Pearl stared at the sign. She didn't want to be a maid. She wanted to be heard, but hunger doesn't wait for dignity to catch up. She rode out to the ranch the next morning. When Harlan answered the door, he looked at her like a man sizing up a storm cloud, quiet, measured, and unsure if it'd pass or pour. "You're here about the job." Pearl adjusted the strap on her guitar, trying to ignore how her dress tugged at the seams. "I am," she said. "I cook, I clean, I don't break easy." He looked her over again and then said, "All right, 1-week trial." Pearl had taken the job no one wanted, and for the first time in a long while, no one had told her she was too much, just enough to start. But what happens when the silence at the ranch speaks louder than rejection? The first time Pearl sang at Coyle Ranch, it was not on purpose. She was hanging linens behind the barn, the cotton snapping in the wind like soft flags. Her boots were deep in the grass, and the sky was turning orange, the kind of dusk that made old grief ache. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, just humming something low and blue to herself, a tune she learned from her mama, half lullaby, half lament. What she didn't know was that Harlan Coyle was nearby, fixing the fence behind the shed just within earshot. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stopped hammering, leaned into the post like it might explain the ache in his chest, and let the music drift over to him like smoke from a fire he hadn't known he'd missed. Pearl sang like no one was listening, because she believed no one ever truly had. But when she turned the corner and saw Harlan's still silent eyes not on her but somewhere deeper, something shifted. She froze, unsure if she'd overstepped. He looked at her and for the first time said more than a sentence. "You don't just sing," he said. "You remember." Pearl blinked. "What do you mean that song?" he said. "My wife used to hum it, when she was hanging sheets just like that." It was the first time he'd spoken of his late wife. That evening she cooked venison stew and biscuits from memory, and he sat across from her at the table, not at the end like a ranch boss, but across like something human. He didn't say much, but when she reached for the salt and he passed it without being asked, Pearl knew something had shifted. The next day Harlan built her a wooden bench under the cottonwood tree behind the house. Didn't explain it. Just said the light's good there in the mornings. And he was right. Pearl sat there every sunrise after chores, sometimes humming, sometimes just letting the wind carry her breath. Weeks passed, and Pearl no longer looked over her shoulder waiting to be judged. She walked barefoot to the creek. She laughed out loud when the goats escaped the pen. She refilled the sugar jar without being told, and every now and then when she thought Harlan wasn't watching, she'd sing soft and low until she heard his footsteps on the porch behind her. It wasn't love yet, but it was warmth, and warmth for someone who'd been so long in the cold felt like a kind of freedom. But what secret does Harlan still carry, one that could crack open the fragile peace they're building? It was near the tail end of summer, when the past came knocking not with fists, but with paper. Pearl was in the barn brushing down Harlan's horse Dusty when she noticed the old saddlebag hanging near the feed room door. It was cracked with time, the leather worn like river stone, but something about it caught her eye that day. Maybe it was the way the morning sun hit the brass buckle, or maybe it was the stillness in the air like the land holding its breath. She hadn't meant to pry. But when she reached for it, the bag fell open, and out slipped a folded envelope with her name written in a hand she hadn't seen in 15 years. Her knees buckled. It was from Clem Dawson, the man she once thought she'd marry. The man who let his sisters whisper she was too big for any decent man, and watched in silence as his family sent her away like a stray dog. That envelope had been forwarded so many times, it looked like it had made its own journey through exile. Hands trembling, she opened it. The letter was short, apologetic, rambling, but the final lines were etched in a kind of coward's ink. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe it wasn't you that wasn't enough. Maybe it was me. There was no return address, just a ghost of regret pressed into yellowed paper. That night she sat on the porch swing, the letter in her lap, trying to understand why it made her ache all over again. It wasn't longing. She didn't want him back. But some part of her, the girl who used to hum by the river with dreams tied in ribbons, still wanted to be chosen, even retroactively. She didn't notice Harlan had been watching her from the edge of the porch, his hat in his hands. "What's that?" he asked gently. "A memory I didn't ask for," she said. He nodded, sat beside her. "I know what those feel like." And then he told her about the child he'd almost had, the boy his wife lost when the fever came through that winter, the name they'd picked, the little pair of boots still in the attic. "I buried them beside her," Harlan said. "The boots. Couldn't bring myself to throw them away." They sat in silence, not touching, but near enough that the air between them felt thick, with the kind of grief only shared by those who've carried it too long alone. Pearl folded the letter and handed it to him. "Burn it with me," she whispered. "I'm done being haunted." And so he did. In the fire pit behind the barn, the letter curled into smoke, and with it a version of Pearl that still needed to be forgiven by someone who never deserved her in the first place. But when the world learns of their closeness, will the town and Harlan's pride let love survive? The rumors came quietly like a drought slipping into a summer, first in the form of narrowed eyes at the general store, then in full bloom on church pews and porches. "She's living with him now, ain't she? You think he'd take a woman like that after Miss Eloise? Ain't it just like a man to lose his mind when he's lonely?" Pearl heard them all. Not directly, not always, but enough to know the town had decided she was too old, too fat, too. Something to be considered good enough for a man like Harlan McKee, widower of a preacher's daughter, owner of the biggest ranch west of the Butte. Harlan heard the whispers too, but he didn't say much. That was his way. Until the day Reverend Abel stopped by. It was a Sunday. The house was quiet Pearl out back, hanging sheets, the wind full of late summer heat. Harlan opened the door, and there stood the Reverend, palms folded, like he came in peace. But the words weren't peaceful. "You know the town's talking," the Reverend began, "and it's not just gossip now. The ladies' auxiliary's asking whether Miss Pearl's presence might discourage attendance at the harvest social. Folks are uncomfortable." Harlan said nothing at first, just stared at the man. "And what do you think, Reverend?" he asked. "I think," the Reverend said slowly, "a man like you ought to be mindful of how things appear." That's when Pearl stepped in. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but she'd heard enough. Her voice was low, steady, like a riverbank holding back a flood. "You want me to disappear again," she said, "like I did when I was 19, and again when I was 30, because I make people uncomfortable, because I've lived and worn every year of it on my skin." The Reverend turned startled. But she wasn't done. "I've scrubbed floors and fed sick men. I've held dying mothers and buried good friends, and I've never once asked your town for anything but a little peace." The silence that followed was heavy. Harlan stepped forward then, not as a rancher, but as a man who'd made his choice. "You want us gone?" he asked. "Fine, but you'll have to say it plain, and you'll have to say it to both of us." The Reverend backed away, his words dried up, and Pearl, standing there with flour on her hands and wind in her hair, realized something: she wasn't going to shrink again. Not for them, not for anyone. But when Harlan makes a quiet proposal and the town turns colder, will Pearl walk away once more, or stay and fight for the life she's built? Snow came early that year, blanketing the hills in soft silence. The kind of stillness that made time feel slower, as if the land itself was holding its breath. In the weeks since the confrontation with the Reverend, Pearl had waited for the town to make good on its quiet threats. But no one came with torches or letters. Instead, something stranger happened. They simply stopped seeing her. Doors that used to open now closed gently when she passed. Conversations quieted. Invitations ceased. She became once more invisible. And still she stayed. She cooked. She tended the animals. She sang to herself while hanging laundry in the sharp wind. And when Harlan sat with her by the fire at night, he didn't speak of leaving or giving in. He simply placed another log on the hearth and said, "You staying warm, sweetheart." That was how love looked in winter, unspoken but steady. Then one night, just after the first full moon of December, Harlan came in from the barn with frost in his beard and something crumpled in his gloved hand. He sat beside Pearl, opened the paper, and showed her a hand-drawn invitation. Not to a church social, not to a town gathering, to their wedding. "I figured," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "we didn't need the town's blessing, just each other's." Pearl stared at the invitation. It was imperfect, misspelled in spots, but it had her name on it. Pearl Ainsley, in ink, in truth, as someone chosen. "Only question is," Harlan continued, "do you still want to marry a quiet man with a big hat and a little house with a leaky roof?" Pearl took the paper in her hands, folded it once, twice. "I do. No crowd, no music, just them standing under a wide cottonwood in the back pasture the next day. Old Marla, who used to sew curtains for the church, came with hot cider and a Bible, and Tom McCrae from the feed store brought his fiddle. The vows were simple. Pearl wore her mother's shawl. Harlan wore his father's boots. And when they kissed, something shifted in the land around them, as if the earth itself had taken notice and approved. Weeks later, the town thawed. It wasn't sudden. Just a nod at the general store, a bag of sugar left at the gate, a pie on the porch. The world still turned slowly for women like Pearl, but it turned. She wasn't part of the Cowboy Carter Tour, never would be. But her song, the one she sang on cold mornings on empty porches in barns with broken hinges, echoed through the valley. It was a song of endurance, of dignity, of late love, of a woman once invisible, now fully seen. And perhaps that's the real legend of the frontier. Not gunfights or gold, but the quiet, defiant women who stayed, who loved, and who made the silence sing somewhere out on the prairie under a sky brushed with starlight. Pearl Maddox sings by the fire, not for a crowd, not for applause, but for the man who hears her with his whole heart. Harlan True doesn't clap. He just sits close, his hand resting gently on hers, letting her know he's listening fully, truly, quietly. Pearl was once told she was too much for the stage, too old, too fat, too everything. But out here among the cottonwoods and cattle, she became just enough, exactly as she was. And maybe that's what love really is. Not something earned or performed, but a place where someone finally says, "I see you. I choose you." If you've ever felt like life passed you by, or that the world couldn't see the music still beating in your heart. This story was meant for you. We'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had a Harlan moment or been someone's pearl? Would you like to see more stories like this? Please comment below. Share this story with someone who needs it, and don't forget to subscribe to None Wild West Saga. Because out here, every heart has a place and every voice, no matter the size or age, deserves to be heard. Until next time, partner, keep singing your song.